Okay, so for this, we're going to go ahead and go over policy and procedures for nonprofit organizations. And we'll just kind of leap in and get started, and we'll track chat for anyone coming in or questions. So this is all part of the Tacoma Capacity Building Project. Overall goal of the Tacoma Capacity Building Project is to provide training and assistance to nonprofit organizations operating and providing services in the city of Tacoma. Its priority focus is going to be on strengthening Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations, newly funded organizations, and a select number of cultural organizations, primarily focused in the arts, culture, science, with a mission to provide access to public programming, or youth education programs in the Tacoma community. This program is presented in partnership with the City of Tacoma's Neighborhood and Community Services Department, as well as the Arts and Cultural Vitality Division, Tacoma Creates or Tacoma Arts. So today we're going to go through a little introductions. Your presenters will go over outlining administration and operations policies, going through some handbook basics, employment policies. We'll do some closing and have some time for questions. Today, this should all be viewed as an overview on administrative operation and employment policies. Specific administration, operation, employment policies are going to vary depending on your organization, what it does, what kind of service it provides, how many employees you have. And so it'll vary from organization to organization, but these are going to be some overviews and help you get started. So policy and procedures. So these are going to help build a strong foundation for your nonprofit foundation. All policies provide a roadmap for your day-to-day activities. They guide your decision-making, streamline operations. Most policies, procedures will outline how you will handle things as they come up, especially around the big one being like employment, fiscal policy, financial management policy, conflicts of interest, all of those sort of things. You'll want to adopt pretty early in your organization. Some of them even are necessary as part of your formation, and they'll help guide you on what happens when something comes up. How do we interact with each other? How do we work together? So administrative, operative, administrative and operations. Strong administrative and operation policies are going to support those day-to-day functions. So they're going to be in various areas, things like legal or conflict of interest policies, insurance, human resources, employment policies, accounting, financial management. They may even govern things like technology use. Kind of going into overall good governance and essential policies. So these are formulated mostly around your organization as a whole, not any one specific part of it. So in good governance with your board, you'll want to be maintaining executive minutes. You'll review all your policies annually, make sure that they're up to date, make sure that they're in compliance with any new laws or regulations that have come out, make sure that they're still achieving the goals you want them to have. You'll, of course, approve the executive director or CEO's compensation. You'll have the board of directors review things like your Form 990s. And then you should always want to publicly disclose the company's 3 most recent returns for being good governance. Additionally, some policies that you'll, as an organization, if you don't have, you should, and if you already have, you'll want to make sure they stay up to date. Is going to be your conflict of interest policy, non-retaliation policies, or whistleblower policies more commonly. Your document retention and records policies, as well as your gift policies. And we're going to jump into some of those kind of essential governing policies.
Hi, Zach. Can I add just quickly? We have had some folks join. If you'd like to put your name and organization in the chat, or if you already introduced yourself, that will help with us taking attendance, so to speak. And welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome everyone who's joining us, and thank you so much for taking the time today. So moving forward with financial policy. So As an overview, financial policies describe and document how the board or operations wants the financial management activities to be carried out. In order to accomplish this, every financial policy needs to address 5 key areas. They assign authority for necessary and regular financial actions decisions. It may include delegating those authority to staff leaders. So, your board, depending on the size of your organization, the things you do, your board might not be making every financial decision for you. You might have, a finance director or something, and even your finance director might have help, and some amount of that work would be delegated down to accountants or other folks. So you want to make sure that your policy clearly outlines who has authority for what action, what decision, and what those lines of delegation are. You'll also usually have a policy statement on conflicts of interest or insider transactions, and we'll talk a little bit about conflict of interest statements in a moment. You'll have clear authority on who to spends funds, who approves those, who signs checks, who runs payroll. You'll have clear assignment of authority to enter into contracts, so who can source contractors for you and sign those contracts and agree to these work. And you'll have clear responsibility for maintaining financial records. And again, these are overviews of financial policy. The main idea with financial policy, and there's a lot of policies you might have depending on what sort of financial work you do, whether that's accepting donations, payment for services, if you take cash or deal in cash equivalents like gift cards or vouchers. All of those things should have policy, and they need to assign clearly who's responsible, or the position that is responsible for handling or receiving the cash, who's responsible for documenting those transactions, who's responsible for maintaining the records of those transactions, and how are these reviewed? What outside person, not outside of your organization, but outside of that process, reviews and checks and balances those activities to make sure nothing happens. In pretty much any financial management policy, any fiscal policy, you'll need to have multiple parties involved, and they need to be essentially unrelated. So you might have, depending on the size of your organization, you might have something like one person who takes all the cash in, you'll have another person who makes sure all those are recorded, and you'll have a third person who oversees the process. But you wouldn't, for example, want someone who takes all the cash and then makes record of all the cash and then deposits it all, and no one ever looks at what they've done. Just there isn't enough good internal control measures within that to be a solid financial policy. So you'll want to make sure all of your policies around finances have plenty of oversight, review, and delegate authority appropriately. Otherwise, you might run afoul, not necessarily legally speaking, but when someone audits or reviews your systems of governance, there might be issues found within how those policies interact. The way to check for policy, like to make sure that your policies are sound, like the things auditors will look for, is they'll test a transaction. So they'll say, what happens if I were to pay cash for this service? And then they'll follow that chain. And if anywhere in that chain they find that there's an overabundance of human error or possible conflicts, then that's found to be kind of a weak policy. Obviously, there's more that goes into it, but as a simple activity, you can kind of walk through who hands off which parts, who signs off which parts, and if anywhere there's the same person both signing the checks and sending the checks out and agreeing to the work, you probably run into an issue. So just as an overview, when you are writing financial policy, 5 areas to address, and then make sure authorities are delegated appropriately. Moving into so conflict of interests. Again, this is going to be more of a general statement about conflicts of interest, is that you should adopt a conflict of interest policy as part of your incorporation. Usually you'll have those incorporated in your incorporating documents, like your articles of incorporation. You'll also adopt a similar policy for your operations or employment side. In both cases, there's 2 essential requirements of a conflict of interest. You need to require those with a conflict to disclose that as soon as they think they have it, as soon as they are aware. And then you're gonna prohibit any interested like board members or employees, for that matter, on voting or acting on that in which there's a conflict. And those are kind of your two basic pieces. However, it should also outline how conflicts are managed. So, such as things like how soon a board member or employee should inform either the rest of the board or a supervisor, what actions might be taken once the conflict is identified, and what assurances do we have that the company's interest won't be compromised. It may even include something like examples of what a conflict of interest might look like in your organization. And these policies can be, they're usually a few paragraphs long, and you want to have adopted kind of a solid methodology. So someone's going to have a conflict of interest. How do they report that? Who do they report it to? What are the lines for investigating whether or not this conflict is real? And how do we make sure that that doesn't affect company decisions or affect our board member voting, or and it can be things like a conflict of interest for like on a board level could be something like a board member owns a company that provides services that you might be interested in working with. Well, there is a conflict there that your board shouldn't be making decisions to work with your own company, right? That it provides that there's a natural conflict there. Not that you can't do it, but how do you ensure that that conflict of interest didn't influence that decision? So maybe that board member who owns that company sits out of those votings and doesn't negotiate the contract, and any payments are made at appropriate market rates for similar services. All of that is how you might avoid that conflict, and that should be documented somewhere in this policy, from like a bird's eye view. With any conflict will be handled at arm's length, that the conflicted members won't be part of the negotiations, etc. Similarly, on the employment side, you might have policies around a person either being managed by or managing a family member. That might be an issue between how those employees interact with each other, who's in charge of who, how that influences the rest of the organization. And not that you can't have a family business or something and have two family members in charge of one another or working in the same group. But if there is a conflict, how is that going to be managed? And you need to kind of outline that in this policy. Think about it. Think about what actions you may take, how that investigation might work, and then just give that documentation and enshrine it both. Like I said, generally at the board level, that's going to be in your incorporating documents, whereas for employees, that's going to be like in a handbook. Next, we have the gift policies. This is from the angle of receiving or giving of gifts. And I only say that to say that this isn't related to fundraising activities. So obviously, gifts from donors, gifts to the organization from donors, receiving either monetary or services, donated services, things like that. Obviously, nonprofit organizations can receive gifts. We're talking about this from the angle of what is your policy around employees receiving personal gifts, board members receiving personal gifts, and how does or giving of gifts, and how does that interact? And the basic guiding principle here is you should never take on the appearance of giving or receiving gifts that is going to imply a manner of personal benefit, favoritism, or other unacceptable business practice. That's going to extend to the entire organization, the board, any employees. And like I said, it's markedly different than fundraising activities. Obviously, you're asking for gifts for fundraising. But you shouldn't, but with the policy, you should, two parts, prohibit any solicitation of personal gifts, loans, services, discounts, etc., that would benefit a person personally, or otherwise create a conflict in your services being rendered by your organization. And the second part is that a gift may come. So you're going to want to establish a policy on what is a reasonable amount and acceptable to receive. An example we wrote here is something like $50 might be you might be able to receive $50 like as a person or an organization. You might be able to go out to coffee or lunch with a potential funder or a potential donor, and none of that has anything to do with receiving a gift or getting favoritism. That's all just normal business and acceptable, but you should make sure that that's documented in some way, if only to classify the difference between receiving a $50 lunch and a $3,000 car or something. You want to make sure that anything you're going to do and write in these policies are to a reasonable person, an action that can be taken that still might be in the interest of the organization and wouldn't, unduly benefit that person. Moving forward, we have the document retention policies. So document retention policy is going to establish a length of time that certain documents and electronic records are going to be retained by your organization. And this is going to be part of ensuring that your board and your organization fulfills their duty of care. You'll want to ensure that your executive director and employees are complying with these policies, and that records are always stored in safe, secure, and confidential manners. If you're going to be transferring files back and forth from storage, either going from active files to inactive files, or if you need to pull files, there should be protocols for what that looks like. Files that are going to be confidential, they need to be designated as confidential or secure or sensitive, and they should only have access by reasonable employees, meaning that you should outline who has access to those kind of files. You'll also want to make sure that there's going to be a difference between physical documents and electronic records. So physical documents, they need to be stored in dry, fireproof locations. They should have pretty much any document should be held in a place that is secured. So a locked door is secured. A filing cabinet with a lock on it can be considered secure. But in a pile on your desk, it is not necessarily secure. Similarly, electronic files should be uploaded to a secure server or cloud-based system, and you should have redundant backups. So if something happens, you're still going to be able to access those files in some way. And data should be regularly backed up. And daily is a really good recommendation for how often it should be backed up. And your retention period is going to be the same for both. Physical and digital files should be treated essentially the same in terms of the retention policy. Another note, all files should be retained for at least their minimum retention period. In Washington State, pretty much any of your general business documentation, your financial records, etc., are going to be kept for 5 years. But some grants, contracts, other activities may request or require that documents be held for longer, and your policy should make sure to reflect that. This isn't, like I said, this isn't necessarily a perfect metric. There are going to be documents that you're required to keep for longer, depending on the type of businesses you do, like healthcare, financial counseling, etc. And so if there's specifics to the work you're doing, make sure that your document retention policies are going to reflect that work. Additionally, employee documentation, all of these same items still apply. But something that is important about employee documentation is they all need to be handled in the same manner. So as an example, all your employee files are either digital or physical. You can't have some employee files that are physical, some that are digital. They all need to be handled the same. And in sensitive employee information, such as Social Security or anything related to medical, things like that, should be kept separate and secure with minimal access or designated access to those things. So the document retention, I wouldn't say that it's particularly hard, but it is something that you should write out and think about, and make sure you have good policies and procedures for how you're going to store documents, where you're going to store documents, and if they are going to be kept electronic, that's clearly documented how to access those things. And that's up next. We're going to be talking a little bit more about employment policies and handbook. And so I'll land there for just a second and just kind of see if we had any questions about kind of general documentation, organizational documentation, and policies before we jump into kind of more employment related items.
So for document retention policies, there could be a general policy for the organization. There also might be something specific for grants or projects you're working on. So always read the fine print and make sure that you're storing documents appropriately. Some grantors may also want physical copies stored somewhere, and some might be okay with electronic records. And so Zach did mention that, but always read the fine print and it's better to keep lots than to shred or archive and not sure where it is. So thank you, Zach.
Yeah. All right, so we'll move a little further into employment. And just to kind of reflect again on what I said earlier, your company may have different needs for your employees. So we're going to go over some pretty standard employment policies, discuss what's going to be necessary in your handbooks, discuss why why you might need certain policies. And at the end, we'll kind of have a list of general policies that maybe we didn't discuss, but might be important to you. A kind of a guiding line here is anything you need to do with your employees should be documented. So that can be anything from time off is going to be documented. You're going to have policies around what holidays there are, when they get holidays, how much they get paid, if they get paid, etc. But it can be all the way up to including day-to-day work that you may work in sensitive areas or childcare or healthcare or other areas that have really some specific policies and requirements that you're going to need documented. And so we're going to guide you through and walk through some general employment policies and practices, what a handbook should include at it's kind of a minimum, so to speak. But anything you need employees to do, any requirements you have employees, any expectations you have of employees, how they show up, how they communicate, those all should be documented in a policy and need to be furnished to the employee immediately. They need to be aware, they need to sign off that they've seen this, and the best way to do that is going to be in an employee handbook. So employment policies and handbooks, you are required to furnish your employees with information regarding any company policies that are relevant to their positions. Although the handbook is not necessarily required, it is, as I said, one of the most useful ways to just give everyone all the policy statements in a nice, easy to read format. It's a good practice that you're going to have them sign and acknowledge that they've received this handbook, or if you're writing a one-off policy, that they've read the one-off policy, and you're going to document that they received this and their understanding of its content. And this is mostly around, one, you want to make sure you're being clear and understood, but two, in the case that you do need to go into disciplinary action or coaching, you want to be able to show that they were aware of these things in the first place. So kind of a first step in an employee handbook, you're going to want to outline employee classifications. It's required and guidelines are established by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And contracted employees might not be subject to these policies, but any of your actual W-2 employees will be. And you want to outline, employees need to be aware of these standards, so you should outline them in your handbooks. So exempt or non-exempt, so whether they're going to be exempt from the overtime requirements. In order to be exempt, there's a number of requirements to how to be exempt in Washington State. There's a minimum salary threshold and a restriction to certain job activities and duties. Most employees are going to be non-exempt. A good, I'll say, rule of thumb around being an exempt employee is persons who have quite a lot of lateral ability within their job description or duties and may have decision-making power generally can be exempt. Something like a manager could be exempt. But someone providing direct services, scheduled and policied out, they probably are going to be non-exempt. They will require to have overtime. You'll also establish a threshold for your full-time or part-time. The Fair Labor Standards Act gives a threshold of 30 hours per week or more for full-time. Washington State considers the full-time threshold to be 32 or more hours. And the main part of this classification is it's going to consider on how it impacts your benefit eligibility, time off requirements, and other employment laws. So you just want to make sure that that's well established. You may also add other classifications, something like if you have temporary employees or like grant structured employees or seasonal employees, on-call employees. And as long as those classifications that you add or create aren't in contradiction to the guidelines around exempt, full-time, and other Fair Labor Standards Acts, you'll be able to make those. It's pretty common to have something like a seasonal employee, and they might have different restrictions, or you might outline, we hire in the summer for 3 months, and this is all part of that employment classification. They might have their own section in your handbook related to their time off or how they accrue certain things or how holidays work for them. And you want to classify if there's going to be a distinct policy regarding their expectations versus a regular employee's expectations. Otherwise, it might not necessarily be important to classify. Employment eligibility verification. You'll make sure to outline these are kind of the standards, but that they're going to complete an I-9 form for every individual you hire for both citizens and non-citizens. And you must both complete your portions of the form. All I-9s need to be completed within 3 days of the employee starting work. And on the form, the employee must attest their employment authorization. They may also present you with acceptable documentations. And the employer has to examine these documents to determine whether they reasonably appear to be genuine or relate to the employee and record that information. Another piece to this that you should make sure, if you're going to have a policy of, you write it out, is how this information is or isn't retained. Once you make the decision, it has to be for all employees. So if you're going to have employees, as an example, upload this documentation into some sort of secure server or system that you then verify the employment information through, and then you destroy that needs to be the same for every employee, and you can't have employees then hand you information physically. It all needs to flow through the same process for every employee. Similarly, if you're going to keep these files, you keep these on file in the employee file, that needs to be the same for every employee. Whichever decision you make, you have to stick to, and all employees have to be treated the same. So, as long as you're writing that out and following those policies, you'll be fine. Another piece here that's maybe not necessarily within the employee handbook, but is a good procedure to have for your organizations is going to be having job descriptions. They're going to be an important tool for defining your structure, and it helps you make sure that employees are kind of following your expectations for their specific duties. And when employing someone, it's going to be a great way to furnish them with exactly what they're going to be doing, and help hold themselves, and you hold them accountable to what you expect. A job description should contain information regarding their classification, their compensation range, who they're going to report to, if anybody reports to them, what the requirements, duties, and responsibilities are, as well as the work location and schedule. And it's a good system to have them sign a copy of these job descriptions and have these placed in their file, as well as them retaining their own. And this is usually in hand with the handbook. There's not necessarily putting all job descriptions in a handbook, but getting into the practice of signed, considered job descriptions is going to help in the long run as you continue to grow your organizations, have more employees, and helps you map out your labor and resources. Something that will. Oh, Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Zach. So for just an aside for a minute or two, for folks that don't, I know we're going through an employee handbook, but for folks that might rely on volunteers or maybe contractors to help them do work, where do those fit? Can you give us some guidance on those two types of people resource, volunteers and contractors?
Sure. So contracts and volunteers aren't employees. So one of the big things here is that these handbooks, these policies, those procedures, they will not they will not necessarily have anything to do with your contractors or your volunteers. You can still have outlined expectations of your contractors and your volunteers. You might have their own, not contractors, but volunteers might have their own handbook, their own documented expectations, or generally what they will do. You'll give them like examples of their duties. You might give them a tour of the facility. You might establish that when they're here, they might need to wear your company T-shirt while they're out on volunteering duties or something. You can have expectations, but they aren't going to be required to stand by like your employee handbook. You wouldn't hand them the whole handbook about all policies and they'd sign off on them. Similarly, for contractors, you can have a lot of things for contractors, but those are all going to be in a separate contract. Contractors, you'll have established a contract or a memorandum of understanding (MOU), and you'll establish exactly what and when and how you want them to do things. But contractors aren't employees, so they don't have days off is a great example. Or you might not be able to tell them they need to use company equipment necessarily. It just depends on the terms you set forth in your contract, and they're going to abide by that contract. Anything that's not in the contract, even if you have a policy internally about it, doesn't matter to them. It needs to be in their contract. And anything you want them to do, like a really good example might be something like security. People work with security companies all the time, and if you don't stipulate certain things in a contract, they're going to wear their own security company logos and their hats and have their own time off policies. But if you're contracting a security company and you want them to, for example, wear your organization's outfit, then you need to work that into your contract, work with the security company to provide those things. Otherwise, you can't hold them to it, unlike employees who you can hold it to them just by having them sign their employment agreements. So just a brief overview on that is that if there's anything you want contractors to do, make sure it's in your contract. If there's anything you want volunteers to do, make sure that's clearly established as part of your volunteer expectations and terms. And then employees have their own handbook. Kind of moving forward a little bit. So definitely what would be in the handbook is going to be your payroll and pay dates. The employer is going to have pretty much freedom to establish any payment schedules they see fit. But the most important, there's a few state laws, but most importantly, regardless of your frequency of your pay dates, you have to pay an employee within 10 days of the close of a pay period. So like, for example, you might see plenty of employers will close a pay period, say on a Friday, and then pay the next Friday. Totally legal, totally doable. That's well within 10 days of the close of that pay period. And you can have whatever pay period you're interested in. Most choose one of three from what we've seen. You might pay once a month, once every other week, or twice a month. And when you choose twice a month, you'll choose the dates that you're going to pay people and then set your pay periods around those. But you can generally establish anything you want, as long as it's going to be it could affect how easy it is to employ people. No one wants to get paid once every 3 months, but there's not necessarily anything preventing you from doing that other than how easy that would be to manage. Secondarily, your pay dates need to be consistent across all employees. There's no restriction on the length of a pay period, but pay periods need to be consistent. They need to be written down, and they need to be able to be tracked. And you shouldn't pay different employees differently. Everyone needs to have consistent payroll expectations. Kind of in that same vein, sick time and time off. So I'm sure we're all aware, but just to go over it, Washington State requires that employees offer a sick time plan. The minimum plan is 1 hour of sick time per 40 hours work. So it's 0.025 hours per hour worked. And this is given to all employees at any accrual level, regardless of how you classify them. There are some counties and cities that might further these requirements. So just kind of be mindful of where your employees work or where you're incorporated to work. City of Seattle, for example, has more expansive sick time plans than what might be required just generally. It's not a requirement that you furnish employees with other kinds of paid leave besides sick leave, but if you choose to do so, you want to include those other types of leave within your policies. And this is where earlier we talked about the classification between like part-time and full-time employees, or exempt and non-exempt employees come in. Or you might, like we said, might have other classification of employees who do different things. And the reason you classify employees is that these type of policies are going to be based on your classification of employee. So if you have for example, might be temporary employees, that are that are employed to work with you as W-2 employees, but for a determined period of time, you might not have them have certain parts of a time off policy. Maybe for normal full-time employees, they're going to acquire 22 vacation days over the year. And at the end of the year, or once they quit employment, maybe you pay out half of those. But a temporary employee, you might say you can acquire your PTO in the same way. You might acquire 22 vacation days, but we're not going to pay it out when you leave. You're a temporary employee. These are just determinations you can make based on your classifications and what policies you create around those. And the only other guiding principle I'd really give is that when creating these things, you got to remember some of these policies may make it harder or easier to employ people. If you determine that you're only going to give sick time and no other time off, people might not want to work for you. So as you're crafting these policies, you can definitely think of other jobs you've held, or your company might already even have these policies. But as you think to make changes and provide different classifications and different benefits, these are all benefits. Think about what might be a good cut between a reasonable budget for these benefits, a policy that can be easily interpreted and followed, and something that employees will want to have and would like to see.
Yep. And a question, Zach, what if somebody is an hourly employee? Where does overtime fit in? I know they're not supposed to work more than 80 hours a pay period in this, or they would be eligible for overtime if they're hourly. Where does that fit in here? Anywhere?
Yeah, so overtime is purely based on the hours you've worked in a week. And I might ask John to help me, but I'm going to try and describe it really quick. I believe the minimum is in a given period. I believe a week period. Overtime is calculated at anything over 40 hours, and it's paid at time and a half. I believe you have some leeway in how you administrate overtime, in that you could have something like an overtime policy where you get paid time and a half for extra hours in a given work day, or you could have it be within a period of time. But regardless, you'd pay that at a time and a half. So you might have something like someone's scheduled 8 hours, they work 9, and you pay that overtime on that 9th hour, even if the next day they only work 7. But still within that week is I believe, the limit. And John, if you could help make sure I'm right on that.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm John. I'm the HR representative for CPIN, and I'm just gonna weigh in a little bit here. I'm also gonna answer the question from Lowell that he just posted in chat after that. So with regards to overtime, so as far as the Fair Labor Standards Act, basically the minimum is that overtime is paid out running for the week and any time worked over 40 hours. And that must be paid out at a time and a half. So you could make a decision to measure it based off of days, as long as that decision netted to the same amount. So you can't do any kind of tricky accounting in which you would pay less overtime measuring one way. You must pay all hours over 40 hours in a week at time and a half. And that's hours in the week, even if your business isn't necessarily open on Saturday. So if you only run Monday to Friday, overtime measures from including the weekend days, so Sunday to Saturday with a new week starting on Sunday. Um, as with regards to accruals, so overtime still counts as worked hours for the purpose of accruals. So you don't necessarily need to offer people additional accruals for overtime. So if people work 1 hour of overtime, that's 1 hour of worked time for the purpose of accruing sick time. So that would be 0.025 hours. Some companies do make decisions to offer additional incentives for overtime. So you can make the decision to offer increased accruals for overtime work, but that's something at your discretion. There's no obligation to do so. And then to address Lowell's question, do part-time employees need to receive sick time? So in the state of Washington, yes, all employees of the company must accrue sick time at that rate, which is 1 hour of sick time per 40 hours worked. Absolutely.
And as we mentioned, that is a minimum. So you can always accrue more sick time. Additionally, and John, just feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I believe you can, it's required that you provide sick time at that accrual rate, but you can include it within an overall policy of PTO, personal time off. So if you don't have something like sick time versus vacation time, you might just create a master policy that says you accrue 1 hour for every 40 hours work, whether it's sick or vacation, and that counts for everything.
Yes, that's correct. So as long as you're allowing people to use that pool as sick time, according to what the law stipulates as sick time, they're allowed to call off and take that protected leave. As long as that pool is allowed to be using that, you can use that as a combined pool, so they can use their sick time for vacation as well. And also, as long as the minimum accrual is kept, so you couldn't have a PTO policy that you used as sick time that had less than this accrual, because you still need to keep to that minimum amount of 1 hour per 40 hours worked.
Perfect. All right, we'll move forward. At-will employment. Some states, including Washington, allow employers to enter an at-will employment relationship with their employees. This means that either the employee or the employer may terminate their employment relationship at any time and for any reason. However, even in an at-will relationship, employers are restricted from terminating employees for any prohibited reason, such as exercising a protected right. And an at-will employer must furnish employees with a statement regarding at-will employment. So usually, again, this would be something, just a general statement you'd have in your handbook, talking about that you are an at-will employer and what that generally means. And as much as employers, as much as you may be an at-will employer, again, restricted from terminating employees for a prohibited reason, protected rights, non-discrimination, etc. Additionally, even for non-protected reasons, terminating people, we would recommend being careful around that sort of thing, in terms of being able, employees filing for things like unemployment and others. If you don't have a good reason to fire someone, even as or terminate someone, even as an at-will employer, they can still file for unemployment. As you're considering termination or exercising your rights as an at-will employer, just be mindful that it's best to have some coaching or disciplinary policy in which you are documenting issues with people's employment, documenting concerns that you have, making sure that the employee is aware of these concerns, making sure you're offering them chances to train or become better or improve their performance. All of these will go into your determination, into a unemployment determination on whether or not there was just cause for the termination of the employee and whether or not you are reliable for any unemployment due to that. So at-will employment is available, and you must furnish all employees with a statement regarding their at-will employment. However, we would caution against always exercising that right as an employer, because using that right indeterminately isn't always the best course of action. Another policy, more again, talking about general policies you might have, is going to be around equal opportunity employment and diversity, equity and inclusion policy statements. They are not a requirement, but it is good to have these items identified and a statement regarding them written into your policies. The EEO statement should cover all federally protected characteristics and any additional characteristics that are covered by state and local law. And we provide a quick example of federally protected characteristics, including race, color, religion, sex, gender identity, orientation, national origin, age, or disability, or generally genetic information. It's good to have these statements written. It's good to be in a positive employer with equal opportunity and DEI policies. Make sure people feel protected and safe and encouraged as employees. But again, these aren't necessarily required, but these are a good place to put these sort of policies if you are going to have them in your organization. So going over harassment and complaints, the employer needs to establish a process by which an employee complaints will be recorded and investigated. This is related and similar to non-retaliation or whistleblower policies, which we'll describe next. But this process is going to include like a general time frame for the investigation, who the employee is going to lodge a complaint to, who is responsible for the investigation. In addition to general complaints, the employer should establish a policy regarding harassment and discrimination, sexual harassment, and how those complaints will be addressed. Above all, complaints investigations should be kept confidential to the extent possible. Disclosure should only be made when necessary in order to conduct the investigation. These policies generally are very long, and they're written not in, obviously, no one should harass each other. Your employees should work well together, and in a perfect world, there would be no harassment and complaints. But as an employer, you need to establish, much like we talked about with some of our other things like the financial or fiscal policies, you need to establish what happens when something does go wrong. So who do people report to? How quickly does that investigation need to be wrapped up? Who's going to be handling those things? If there's a conflict, for example, an employee might have a trouble with their superior. Who else can they report to? What systems do the employees have at their ability to make complaints and lodge issues for investigation? Similarly, if a conflicted person's in charge of the investigation, who else can be responsible for these investigations? And they can be pretty long. They can be like a couple pages long, and it's mostly around thinking through who in your organization what process can be established that keeps it the person who's lodging the complaint safe, who is going to be doing the due diligence in investigating these things, and how do we as an organization handle these concerns in a safe manner, and keep these things confidential to the extent possible. It may be that in the course of the investigation you have to say names or talk about these things, but you shouldn't do that in a blasé manner. You need to be careful and thoughtful in how you approach these things. Combined with this, talking about the non-retaliation or whistleblower policies. And this, as part of these complaint procedures, are establishing that employees will not be subject to any form of disciplinary action or retaliation for filing a complaint. Like we said, these can also be called whistleblower policies, and it's intended to encourage employees and others that they can make good faith reports of suspected fraud, corruption, improper activity, other case safety concerns, without the company or the company's agents creating problems for that employee. And these policies would go hand in hand. So you would write a policy around who and how and in what manner harassment or complaints are investigated, and you would also write a policy within there about a statement of non-retaliation, and in working in good faith with your employees. Another thing you might have in your handbook is going to be your electronic communications and social media policies. So developing reasonable policies about the use of electronic devices in the workplace, the appropriate use of company equipment, and whether or not employee social media profiles will be monitored. It's not a requirement, but again, you want to keep in mind what's going to be reasonable and necessary when drafting the policy. So if an employee utilizes social media for work purposes, it's going to be important to distinguish in this policy the expectations for work-related social media compared to personal social media. If you're going to be monitoring employee social media, you should do it for all employees. And that needs to be established with the employees ahead of time. You can't just check in on their social media suddenly and determine what they're saying or how they present themselves is not in alignment with your company, and then you're going to discipline or terminate them or whatever's going to happen around that. You need to have these things well established. Again, there should be the through line of this part, these conversations is about anything that you're going to expect of your employees should be well documented, and the employee should be well aware of the policies, or at least to a reasonable outsider that they would have had knowledge of these things. Again, it may be possible that employees might not understand them, but if you're making any attempt and every attempt to be clear and concise and express your needs as an employer, then you're doing your part of upholding your policies. And that's kind of take us to sort of the end of the kind of the specific employees policies, but there's a lot of policies that we didn't include here. And again, the idea being that there's just too many. There's going to be all sorts of things your organization may or may not need or want or need to establish with your employees. But all of these should be handled in that same kind of manner. So things like, we didn't include talking about benefits, if that's applicable to you, but if you have benefits, you're going to have policies written around who gets benefits, full-time, part-time employees, what the cost share on those might be, what benefits are applicable to them, when they might get their benefits, if there's a waiting period. You may have things about timekeeping procedures. So if employees aren't non-exempt and salaried employees, then how do they keep time? Is there a paper sheet? Is there a punch card? Is there a system? What happens if they make a mistake? Who's responsible for signing off on their timekeeping? Who's allowed to make edits in a digital timekeeping system? Obviously, you might have things like meal periods and breaks. Another idea being you might have holidays. If you're observing holidays, there's no requirement that you observe federal holidays. There's no requirement that you pay employees extra money for working on a holiday or give them time off for working on a holiday or anything like that. But if your organization wants to have holidays, make sure that you're furnishing a list of holidays for all your employees. Make sure that that's established as part of your payroll systems. Make sure if you're paying extra money for holidays, that is across all employees, they're getting the same sort of benefit, or at least all within the same classification. You might have, specifically if you work with children or you work in healthcare or you work in the food services, you might have very specific policies regarding the legal constraints of childcare, healthcare, and food safety that would need to be outlined in these policies. So again, we haven't gone over every specific iteration of every policy that's available, but there's a lot of things you should think about, and in all cases, make sure that it's well documented, make sure that lines of authority within those policies are clear, if there needs to be lines of authority, and make sure that employees are made aware of the policies overall, that if there's confusion, maybe you're rewriting the policy, right? You want them to be clear and available and well established with your employees. Going over some some general resources around these topics. There's the Washington Nonprofit Handbook, which is a wonderful and very large tool about running nonprofit organizations. So some of the legal considerations, the policies considerations that you might have. Similarly, there's a bunch of resources through Communities Rise, mostly around legal policies, adopting conflict of interest policies, organizational documentation. A great human knowledge resource is going to be SHRM. It does cost money. I want to say it's a few $100s a year, but it's a fantastic resource for articles, blogs, templates, job descriptions, law updates from time to time. They might not cover every single law that ever exists in every state, but they'll cover quite a few of them. And they're a wonderful area that you can get all sorts of HR knowledge and human resource tools and tips. And then for nonprofits in general, the Council of Nonprofits has a lot of free articles and blogs about nonprofit standards, nonprofit articles, nonprofit policies and procedures, and the hows and the whys, and they have some amount of templated resources as well, but they're a great place to look for things. Additionally, we just want to do a quick plug for free resources through this project, the Tacoma Capacity Building Project. So there's free nonprofit training resources through Clark Nuber. They're over 70 years. Clark Nuber has provided sophisticated accounting and consulting services across the Northwest. And they have over 300 professionals who bring world-class expertise to managing strategies for financial health management and growth. So they're fantastic, especially around fiscal policy, compliance, being ready for audits and everything you might have as a nonprofit. Similarly, there's extensive library of webinars to all nonprofits here as part of the Tacoma Capacity Building Project. We'll be sending out these slides, after the presentation today. And there's sign up to stay informed about, industry developments, and subscribing to their monthly newsletter. So with that, I think these slides are slightly out of order. Sorry, but I was going to say questions, but we're kind of coming to the close. So I'll skip ahead for just a second here. But just any questions, so any questions you had on policies, maybe there's specific things your organization might be dealing with, or concerns you might have, feel free to ask us anything here. And if you don't have anything today, you can always reach out to us, tcb@the-CPIN, and we can meet with you and maybe go a little bit further in depth on what you might be facing, or answer those questions. We have all sorts of resources here for you. So always feel free to reach out.